David Chalmers on Panpsychism. David Chalmers is an Australian philosopher who teaches at New York University, New York City. His areas of specialty include philosophy of mind, philosophy of language, cognitive science, and neuroscience. He's especially known for his work on the hard problem of consciousness. This is an area in contemporary philosophy that we haven't really touched on, and he's an interesting contributor to that area. He's trying to find a way to think about consciousness so that a science of consciousness can appear that would enable us to have a science of consciousness. So here, it's not, this interest in consciousness isn't just metaphysics, as maybe we've encountered previously when we looked at some of the work that was interested in the nature of consciousness. But here he's interested in trying to develop a way of thinking about consciousness such that the theory of consciousness, and scientific theory of consciousness, can come into being. He acknowledges that that's, for some people have felt in the past that wasn't even possible, that consciousness in its nature is subjective. Say each of us is conscious, and each individual's consciousness is a little bit different from everybody else's. And science, though, strives to be objective. So there's some question about whether you can have an objective science of a subjective reality. Nonetheless, that's what his aim at, and I think it's a significant aim. He feels that it would help us to clarify some things about who we are and how we relate to the world that we live in. So let's see what his approach is. Trying to understand what Chalmers is trying to do here, we're going to go back into history, maybe about 400 years actually, to the beginnings of the modern period of philosophy. We did a segment on this in our class when we started by taking a look at the philosophy of René Descartes. If we remember, Descartes was referred to as the father of modern philosophy. And his goal initially was, he was disappointed with the status of the traditional understanding that people had in philosophy, and he wanted to try and put it on a scientific basis. So he wanted to try and establish a new beginning for philosophy, and he went about that by applying a rigid kind of radical skepticism to everything that he knew. And he felt like he couldn't really accomplish his goal unless he could start with something that he was absolutely certain about. So he used that standard sort of to examine what he thought he knew, and pretty soon the only thing that he had left, or that he came to, was his famous cogito ergo sum, or the statement, I think, therefore I am. So this was the one thing that he thought he could be absolutely certain about. But it was a peculiar kind of thing. It was just certainty about the fact that he was thinking. it wasn't certainty that about whether or not what he was thinking corresponded with a reality beyond his thinking, but it was the certainty about the thinking itself. So he couldn't deny the fact that these thoughts were there, and 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 because of that, he could conclude that ensured his existence. So I think, therefore, I am. We just abbreviated that discovery as the cogito. Now, what Descartes did after that was a little more questionable even to the philosophers of his own day. And we don't have to go into that specifically, but what people were interested in, or what kind of set the tone for the interest of this early modern period in philosophy, was just simply that, the cogito, this more than what we can know about the world. There's always some question about that, but we can be certain that we have this consciousness, that we have this awareness. This what Descartes called my thinking. So that became, but then there was a question. I mean, how does this thinking, how does my thinking, how does my consciousness relate to the world beyond my thinking, outside myself? And that was kind of the guiding question of the age for people. Descartes' own solution was not satisfactory for a lot of people. So there was a lot of exploration of the alternatives back during that time period. I want to do a review of some of those because they kind of set the stage for contemporary investigations into what consciousness is. It was so that kind of, I think that'll help frame sort of what Chalmers is trying to do. You might recall that Descartes' own position, we referred to it as common sense dualism. Common sense because it's what seemed to be the case. And according to Descartes, then there was two kinds of things that actually existed. There was extended things, or you could say bodily things, material things in the world. You could say these were objective entities and were governed by the laws of nature, or by physical laws, physical reality. And then there was also the world of mind or thought, which was not which was immaterial. And because it was immaterial, it wasn't governed by physical laws. And you could still argue that in the world of thought, or in the world of spirit or consciousness, that freedom existed. And because freedom existed in the mind, you could argue that human beings are free to make choices and take responsibility for the choices that they make. So that meant that moral responsibility sort of came along with this kind of theory. Difficulty is that he wasn't able to explain how it could be that something physical could cause anything to happen in a realm which was immaterial, like in the mind. If the mind was immaterial, how could anything physical, even the human body, cause anything to happen in it? And vice versa. And how could something immaterial, like an immaterial thought, cause anything to happen in the world of the body? So that was a problem that Descartes had, to which he didn't really offer a suitable explanation. So, common sense dualism didn't really work. It may have seemed to be the case, but on assuming that we have these two parts of ourselves and they have different kinds of natures, we couldn't really explain the possibility of any interaction between the two. So this failure, led other thinkers to acknowledge that on the basis of these assumptions, you can't get a good theory about the relationship between the mind and the body. So people experimented trying to come up with alternative points of view. And you can say the history of early modern philosophy was really a history of the exploration of some of these other possibilities. So if dualism doesn't work, then maybe we need to reduce the number of terms. Instead of dualism, maybe we adopt some sort of monist position. Only one kind of substance actually exists. Either maybe only bodies exist, or maybe only minds exist. Of those two options, the one that seems more plausible would seem to be that only bodies exist. So that position would be called materialism, maybe physicalism still today. So, and argued really that there was only one reality, and that was a material reality. What appears to be the world of thought or some sort of immaterial world of spirit or mind, is ultimately just some kind of an illusion, which is really can be understood only if you analyze and assume that there's a kind of material basis for what appears to be immaterial thought. So that was a popular, and that was a point of view that seemed friendly to a scientific perspective. And when you looked at this previously, you can remember, I think Thomas Hobbes was associated with this position, but really it's a position that has a wide range of supporters, and especially within the scientific community, with good reason, as we'll see. Science requires measurability, and subjective experience resists scientific or objective quantification. So science sees thoughts or mental processes in terms of some kind of materiality, electrochemical or electromagnetic terms, maybe. Or maybe it appeals to finer and finer degrees of materiality, but never getting to the point of the immaterial. The criticism of this approach is that it's reductivist. In other words, it reduces reality to terms it can deal with. Science reduces mental states to terms that it can actually deal with, to things that it can measure, and then denies that there's anything really beyond that. Or maybe it maintains that if we can't study the phenomenon scientifically, then it's irrelevant because it's unknowable. So that's what we're left with there. The other monist approach to this problem was to get rid of the bodily element and just argue a case for idealism. And back in the early modern period, we identified that position with George Berkeley, who argued that only minds and ideas in minds exist. And what seems to be the physical world to us is where the illusion is. You could argue that what we do know, what we think we know about the physical world, we only know through our awareness of it, which is, again, consciousness or a mental approach to it in a way. You can go back, I mean, even as far back as Plato, where you could say Plato was kind of an idealist. He believed in the truest realm of reality was an ideal realm, and that what we take to be the physical world is kind of derivative. It sort of comes out of the ideal realm somehow. There are, in some religious ways of thinking, in some Hindu philosophy, for instance, you could say that there's idealist type positions which argue that there's kind of cosmic mind or something like that, and that what our common sense perception is just kind of an illusion that you have to get past in order to realize what the ultimate truth of reality is. Also, you could say in some versions of Buddhism as well, there's really arguments that everything comes from the mind, and so it's kind of to liberate your mind from the illusions that it has. In philosophical history, there's a whole string of idealist thinkers, the German idealists, for instance, a whole list of philosophers from Hegel to Schopenhauer. In a way, you could say that when we made a case for materialism, at least there's something intuitive about that. I mean, it looks plausible. I mean, but if you're trying to make a case for idealism, it's kind of counterintuitive, so it's harder to make a serious case for an idealistic solution to the problem. So it doesn't seem as though there's many attempts to really come up with a viable idealistic explanation of reality in the current age. In the early modern period of philosophy, there was a fourth alternative that we listed, and that was full aspect theory. We associated that position with Spinoza, and also could be associated with Leibniz as well, although their philosophies they had this similarity, but significantly different too. This was a return to dualism again. So we've given up on the monistic approach. This is another kind of dualism. Because it's dualistic, we can argue that there's a physical and a mental aspect to reality. But in this case, they're not separate substances, but rather they're different aspects of one and the same reality. Physical processes which are accompanied by consciousness thereof. It's only one sequence of events in a particular entity, like myself. If I raise my arm, there's only one sequence of events. It's never the case that mind tells the body to raise the arm and the body obeys, but rather at every moment of the movement there is something physical going on, and also a kind of an awareness of that movement as it happens. So one substance, but two different attributes. This brings us pretty close to the position of panpsychism, which is the one that we want to take a look at. Dual aspect theory was intriguing when we first took a look at it, but it was a little difficult to understand. I think dual aspect or panpsychism as a theory will help us understand what dual aspect was aiming at. So this brings us back to our announced theme of panpsychism. Instead of dual aspect theory with Spinoza or Leibniz, we have panpsychism with David Chalmers. Again, almost 400 years later. But the question or the problem of consciousness is still remains unsolved. It's some kind of mystery. It's obvious that we are conscious, that we have this consciousness, but why? Why are we conscious? No one seems to know the answer to this as yet, maybe. This is the hard problem of consciousness. Not so much the question of how the brain correlates with various functions that we might have, where that activity might take place in the brain. As Chalmers sees it, those are the easier problems of consciousness. Those we already kind of know how to solve, and we will continue to have more clarity about them. But really, what we don't know is sort of why does this activity in the brain give us our world of inner experience. Two Greek words, pan, meaning all or nature, and psyche, meaning soul or mind, gives us panpsychism. Chalmers rejects the idea that we can answer the question of consciousness through strictly a materialistic approach. We've already looked at the earlier version of materialism, so that's still an approach that some people believe is the only legitimate approach that we have. Daniel Dennett, is a proponent of that. Chalmers feels like he's tried that and reached a point where he saw that it just doesn't work. Or he doesn't explain the reasons, but he's got them. He proposes what he calls a couple of crazy ideas to help us get beyond the impasse that we seem to be stuck in terms of making progress on the question of consciousness. He refers to these as a couple of crazy ideas, but maybe they're not so crazy. They're kind of can maybe help us move forward. The first one is that he suggests that we think of consciousness as fundamental, as in physics theorists could say that space, time, mass, and charge are all fundamentals, and then you can build on the basis of that kind of foundation and move your science forward. He would have us add consciousness to this list of fundamentals. And so space-time, mass, charge, and consciousness are fundamental. Then you can ask the second question is it universal? Like all the other fundamentals are also universals, space-time, mass, charge, etc. Is consciousness also is fundamental and universal? This really is, you answer that in the affirmative. That's panpsychism. According to panpsychism, all systems are conscious to some degree. All material entities have some degree of consciousness. If we accept that as a working hypothesis, then maybe we can get to the science of consciousness. But the truth is, we don't know yet if it is true. Chalmers admits that he's more certain that consciousness is fundamental than he is that it's universal. Still, the potential is there. Panpsychism has the potential to help us even integrate consciousness into nature. Provocatively, Chalmers states that consciousness puts the fire into the equation. Puts the fire into the equation. Now, what do you think he meant by that? I don't know about you, but I think of Heraclitus. Toward the end of his talk, Chalmers mentions the promising work of Giulio Tononi, who measures the degree of consciousness by the amount of information integration accomplished by it, and gets a number phi. So complex organization, high level of phi, lower level complexity, lower level of phi. If that's the measure that we're going to make use of, then we have to consider the consciousness of computer systems, it looks like, of artificial intelligence, of virtual realities, and then maybe ethical considerations come into play. It's really the degree of complexity of consciousness that would make the difference in terms of how much human consideration should be given in these cases. Finally, I'd like to say that it's encouraging to me that people are working along these lines. It's pretty interesting stuff. I've put a couple of possible resources for you here. The one I put out for our class is the first one, the TED Talk. The second video is also helpful, I think. It's not very long. Might help you understand, broaden your understanding of what's going on here. Finally, one fun fact I thought I'd mention is that David Chalmers is the lead singer of the Zombie Blues Band. pretty amazing. You can, look up to see some performance videos. One commentator said that Chalmers, with his leather jacket and his biker haircut, is the closest thing that philosophy has to a rock star. So I concur.